Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, HOA Destroys Veterans' Business and Repeatedly Trespasses on Private Property. Hello, I'll start by saying my name is Justin and I am now an out-of-action war vet. But that's not to say this story isn't action-packed, so make sure you got a comfy chair because this is going to be long. After almost a decade of active service, I plan to leave the military and move with my wife back to my hometown. Together we managed to buy a large house out on the coast in a nice neighborhood managed by a local HOA. Because I was serving my country overseas, I didn't know much about these HOAs. I didn't think they would be so bad, at first. I later came to realize just how bad, clique and political their mess is. The issues began not long after we moved in, with letters piling up about really minor things, like leaving my boat on my driveway, which sucked, especially as we couldn't have been more than 100 yards from the water. Another odd one was that our grass was 2 millimeters too high according to some local rule that all gardens had to be neat and uniform. I was annoyed but complied, taking my boat to a marina and cutting my grass more often. In our third year at the house, the next door neighbors moved out and an older couple called Karen and Tim replaced them. It was sad at first because they were really supportive when we first moved in. The new neighbors weren't so bad though. They let my kids use their pool and we'd often hang out in the evenings and weekends. Unfortunately, everything changed after Karen decided to run for president of the HOA, which she later succeeded at. We were all happy at first, but then the changes began. For the next week we noticed Karen walking around the streets a few dozen front yards as she wrote on her notepad. In some cases she even invited herself into some people's backyards, much to their shock and annoyance. On her walks she'd often took a small disposable camera from the general store to take pictures of what she considered to be violations. After this initial strangeness, we quickly got used to her weird and invasive presence, assuming she was just taking her job at the HOA seriously. I came home one evening to find her on my back porch looking around and taking more pictures. I was a police officer at the time, so I knew a few things, and while I tried to be nice by informing her, she could get into a lot of trouble for what she was doing. She rudely let me know that as the HOA president she was entitled to go into people's private property and even their houses to inspect them if need be. This led to a longer argument of me informing her of my rights and laws against this, but all it managed to do was start a minor war. And here I was thinking that my days of active duty were over. We immediately started receiving fines from $100 and up for very minor issues they had supposedly found from my house and yard. I fixed the issues quickly enough that I never had to pay the damn fines in the end, but it didn't stop me filing complaints against the HOA property management company. Although in retrospect I know for sure the complaints were either lost before reaching them or tossed into the trash after reading, as nothing ever changed. And then just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, IT happened. So, I also used to own a small business which I needed a truck and trailer for. One eventful day I had this parked in front of the house, and in true Karen fashion I noticed her gawking around it with her camera. According to the rules of the HOA it was not allowed to be there overnight. And even though it was on my driveway I always moved it before the evening. Karen then had the audacity to get me towed, in the middle of the night, by her shady friend who runs a tow truck company. Despite this, I received a letter and a fine for $100 stating that I had left the vehicle there overnight. This time I had had enough. I asked for a review with the HOA board of directors, the property management company, their attorney, and my attorney. This was going to cost all of them bastards a lot more than their petty $100 fines in time and money. At this meeting I asked Karen, the HOA president, to present what evidence she had other than the one picture to prove that the vehicle was there overnight, ideally with timestamps as well. But of course, she could not. I then asked for them to drop the unreasonable fines and violations against me, but they refused. I was publicly berated by the HOA president in front of the board and my attorney, saying that I should be a good little soldier, and do as I was told by the HOA, to shut my mouth and obey the rules like everyone else. At this point my attorney assured me that we now had enough evidence of harassment due to secretly recording the meetings with the HOA. As we were about to leave, I told everyone in the room that we had been recording them. This only fanned the flames of war, and they grew so aggravated that they threatened to call the police for violating the law. But being a soldier, I knew the law better and, in our state, it was more than legal and well within our rights, so I wasn't too worried. Later that day, after a serious discussion with my wife and attorney, I called the HOA back to announce the lawsuit we were planning to raise against them, hoping to bring them down and bankrupt them in the process. According to state law and the HOA bylaws, in the event the HOA ceased to exist or became bankrupt, each and every one of the 35 houses the HOA managed would have their mortgages immediately due and payable. Although most people don't know this exists in a lot of HOA covenants. I guess you could consider this more of a bluff. I had very good friends in the neighborhood and did not want to see their families affected, but it scared the HOA enough that they stopped their fines and Karen stopped her snooping. About a month later, the HOA started their elections for a new HOA board, and I informed several people across the neighborhood that I would be running for the HOA board president. On the night of the board election, we got together and all attended. In all, there were only about 10 people that showed up to vote. After giving our speeches, we raised our hands to count the total votes. There were 6 people along with myself who voted for me, but miraculously the property management company ended up declaring it a unanimous vote in favor of the reigning HOA president. Outraged, I stood my ground and asked for my 6 neighbors to raise their hand higher so they could properly count, but the PM ignored it since their victory had already been recorded into the minutes of the meeting. At that point, I decided to let the public know about the ongoing fines and mistreatment I had been experiencing from the HOA, about the previous meeting, mortgages, suing the HOA, and now calling the state attorney general's office. In an almost overnight change of pace, the property management company was changed out. The HOA president was replaced with a nice, level-headed gentleman, and I never, ever so much as heard a peep from the HOA ever again. I played by the rules more or less, but eventually sold the house and moved on. Moral of the story: never mess with a paratrooper. The next story is entitled Aunt Insists on Getting Some Things from My Mother's Hoarder House. I never eat at my aunt's house again, and the story of how I got grandma's property in my name. Background: I'm an only child. My mother was 3 of 9, divorced, and their mother, my maternal grandmother, had already passed, as well as grandfather in 76. This will be important because I pull a card on an entitled aunt. My mother died in 09. She was a hoarder, and her house was filthy and moldy. She lived in severe squalor. I was 41 when my mother died, and we were estranged at the time due to her abusive nature. Oh, this is also important. My mother would chain her chain link fence with a chain and a lock, and hand nearly boarded up her back door. One of the 2 front doors was blocked with her hoard. Now, she lived in a poor and dangerous neighborhood, but her manner of barricading herself was a clear sign of mental illness and not just for protection. Another thing to note was the house my mother lived in was still in grandmother's name, as she had never put the house in her name. All of her siblings felt she should have it when grandma died because she'd essentially be homeless. Aunt Flo had the same name as my grandmother. All this happened around the time of my mother's funeral. The incident: when my mother passed, it was upon me to do all of the funeral arrangements. I actually had to fly in and waited until my husband, then boyfriend at the time in 09, would drive in for the funeral, and I'd drive back out with him, so that meant I didn't have a vehicle. Out of 42 some odd cousins, only one was really there for me. Let's call her Sahara. One of my aunts, let's call her Flo, was my godmother. In my family, godparents had sort of the same authority as parents did, but not as much, and if they duck up, our actual parents will lay down the law with them. Most, however, weren't so bad, but a few of the women from my mother's siblings really took the "I'm your mother" entitlement way to the edge. Personally, I think my mother was the worst, but I'm biased. Both my mother and Aunt Flo were divorced and single mothers. Aunt Flo did eventually remarry while my mother never did, but he was out of the picture at the time of this occurrence. Flashback. An example of how Aunt Flo ducked up once. I grew up in California and I'd spend summers with my grandmother in Texas. Aunt Flo would take on extra care of me being my godmother, and her 2 daughters, my cousins, obviously, were close to my age and we'd all play together. One summer we were being particularly ornery brats and her car had issues starting up when we were trying to leave a department store. A man had come to help my aunt and, in her frustration and anger at the whole situation and us children, who were single-digit age at the time, weren't helping either. She yelled at us to get back in the car. When she spanked us, she spanked her 2 daughters with her open bare hand. However, when she spanked me, she picked up a wrench and hit me on my bottom several times. I had a red bottom for a while, and when we got to Grandma's house, I called my mother in tears. Woo boy, shit hit the fan and I was out on the next flight literally that day, and since grandmother didn't drive, Aunt Flo got to take me to the airport. She was furious I ratted her out. So, the duck. What? I'm 54 and my butt is tingling from the memory. It was that impactful. Continuing. Okay, so, back to my mother's funeral. Remember, I'm an only child at 41 making funeral arrangements, and then I was going to have to deal with my mother's horde. Ew. I'm staying with the one cousin who was helping me get around town when I get a call from Aunt Flo. The conversation is paraphrased. Aunt Flo. HDMX 539, you need to get to your mother's house right now. Me. Why? Aunt Flo. Because I need to get into it. Me. Why? Aunt Flo. I want to see what she's got in her house. Me. Why? Aunt Flo. She's got some things I want, and she also has my dresser. That's why. Stop asking me why and get over here and open her house. My cousin took me over because, well, we didn't want her breaking in because she sounded unhinged. I mean, my mother's house was filthy and, frankly, there's nothing in there Aunt Flo could use, there's mold in there. So, Sahara and I head over, and Aunt Flo had already used a chain cutter to cut the measly little lock that held the chain together to lock the gates. Geez. I had the key lady and you already summoned me, you couldn't wait for that? So, we get there, Sahara and I go around to the back of the extremely small, literally 4-room dilapidated house and see that the back door was opened. Okay, deep breath because yeah, Aunt Flo broke into my mother's home. I walk in and see her rummaging through my mother's stuff. Me. Aunt Flo, why couldn't you have waited? Aunt Flo. I want my dresser. It wasn't hers, I just let her borrow it. Me. You could have waited without destroying the back door and the front gate lock. Aunt Flo. She was my sister. Don't you talk to me like that. I'd had it. I yelled back. Oh yeah? Well, she was my mother. I enunciated each and every single word. I was fed up with her shit and I never got over being hit several times with a wrench that one summer day. At those words she backed down because she knew I was right. I brought it up in such a way as to remind her of her mother's death and how she felt. Now, to be honest, I was glad my mother died because that meant her abuse definitely stopped even though we were no contact at that point. Aunt Flo backed down from that. She tried to pull authority over me, but I had my own trump card. Aunt Flo. Well, I at least want my dresser back. Me. Fine. Call Ricky Bobby, her daughter's baby daddy, and get his truck here. I'll help clean things out for you. She makes the call, and as I empty out the dresser, I pull out of it an unused wooden cutting board with some knives. You could tell it was unused because there was a piece of shrink-wrapped plastic still around it to hold the knives. It was a single band of plastic wrapped and exposed the edges of the cutting board. It was basically to hold the knives together with the board. Now, this cutting board is wood. There's mold in the house. The cutting board is wood with the sides exposed. Get where I'm going with this? Yeah, a fibrous material with exposed edges in a moldy house. Aunt Flo had called Ricky Bobby and Ricky Bobby was on the way with his truck. Sahara was outside waiting. She didn't want to come into a horde in squalor and I did not blame her. In fact, I told her not to come inside even though she would have gladly helped. The moment that Aunt Flo saw me pull out the new cutting board she grabbed it. I looked at her and she said, I want this. She stared me down. We've had previous challenges in other situations as I was an adult. Almost as if to dare me to challenge her on it. Me. Well, okay. But you realize that is ruined, right? There's mold all over this house and that's exposed wood. Now, bear in mind that you couldn't see the mold as none of the cutting board had any black on it, but you know, it's absolutely there. Aunt Flo. It's fine. It's brand new. I don't see anything on it. I'll wash it and it'll be fine. Me. Making a weird face and thinking, I'm never eating at this woman's house ever again, and I never did even though I did visit. Okay. Keep it. But I wouldn't use it. You can't see the mold but it's definitely there. Aunt Flo. So, you were just going to throw it away then, right? So, I can have it. Me. Yeah, keep it. Everything in here is junk away and it's all moldy even though you can't see it. The wood, the clothing. Her eyes squinted and she made that cat butt face, because she knew I was also implying her stupid dresser. We proceeded to finish cleaning out the dresser, Ricky Bobby arrived, and I let Aunt Flo and Ricky Bobby wrestle the dresser out of the house. I also told her that she can have anything else she wanted because yes, I was just going to throw it all away. I basically stood around and let them do all of the work because fuck all if I was going to be in that place any longer, but I did need to find a way to close up. And in fact, while Aunt Flo got what she wanted, Sahara and I went to a hardware store to figure out a way to close up the house. Epilogue. I had visited Aunt Flo a few times after that incident in the years following. The first time I saw that cutting board I asked her if that was the same one and she confirmed that it was. She still had the knives too. She did say, "See, I told you it was fine. We haven't gotten sick, y'all." I never ate at her house again. And she fed her grandchildren using food cut on that wooden board. Now, why was it important to bring up the fact that she had the same name as my grandmother and that that little property was never put in my mom's name? I had forgotten to pay the WE taxes on it for a couple of years. By then, the property had overgrown vegetation. They deemed the house condemned. The city had gotten a few complaints that drug addicts were living in there by neighbors. Yes, my bad, I know. I was struggling to keep it up being long distance, and ultimately the city was going to raise the house and remove the debris. It was going to cost $5,000 to do so. The city had to find the owner only to find out there were still 6 adult children of my grandmother alive. They all received a letter from the city mentioning that if the house was not taken care the above actions I listed were going to happen and they would owe the $5,000 to the city that this would cost. Yes, it was a very small house. My family being generally poor couldn't really scrounge up that money. I did not know that letter had been sent out until one of my uncles called me about it and then I get a screeching banshee call from Aunt Flo freaking out because the house was in her name and she thought she was going to be responsible. Remember, she has the same name as Grandma and the property was still in Grandma's name. So, while the letter was addressed, technically, to my grandmother, Aunt Flo saw literally her name and freaked out. I had to reassure everyone that this will get taken care of. My husband and I got the money together, the city raised the house and cleared off the property and we paid it. I then go onto the county's website to take care of property taxes and I see that the property was in my name. Whoa, I never did anything on that. I was about to start the process, too. I called the tax office, and I was told that there was a quit claim deed filed for that property. I later find out that someone told Aunt Flo that since she had the same name as Grandma, to simply do a quit claim deed to me, and once my name was on it, I was on the financial hook now since her name was no longer on the deed. While I had no problem paying the money, I was ducking pissed at the way she handled this. She never called to tell me, she just did it thinking that I wasn't going to do anything about it even though I had said I would pay and did pay these fines. Anyway, that WE property is in my name now, it's an empty lot, I keep the vegetation cut, pay its taxes every year and check up on it. It's not worth anything because it's such a small property, but it is in an area that's starting to be gentrified. I'm friends with a neighbor as we were childhood friends, and we're trying to make sure the area doesn't get gentrified. I also know I need to make sure the property is mine, but it's been over a decade since that situation, so I'm just going to let it sit for a minute. In the meantime, I get hounded by investors because they're trying to buy up properties in that area. I keep saying no. Thank you for listening.